They called it a conservation zone. We called it a cage. The bird would not stop singing. Cale had noticed it the moment he cracked the cargo door of the transport. A small golden conure, in a reinforced alloy case, her feathers the color of old brass, her eyes round and black, and watching him the way animals sometimes watch you when they know something you don't. He'd named her Pip, because she made that sound when he slid a protein wafer through the grating, and because naming things was something Cale did when he was afraid. He was afraid now. The distress beacon in his scout vehicle had gone dead 12 minutes after he crossed the Vithara exclusion line. Not a gradual signal bleed. Not the slow attrition of distance. It had simply stopped, mid-pulse, like a heart that changes its mind. The navigation system followed 4 seconds later. Then the atmospheric scanner. Then, absurdly, the headlights. Even though it was full daylight by Vithara's standards, which meant the sky was a bruised violet gray with 3 pale suns hanging low like old scars. Now the vehicle sat tilted on a ridge of black roots stone, its front axle swallowed by a gap in the ground that hadn't been visible in any of the pre-mission topographic scans. Cale had walked 2 kilometers since then, cargo case in one hand, sidearm in the other, Pip singing her strange small tune, and he was no longer certain he was walking in a straight line. The forest of the Vithara interior was the reason the Interstellar Survey Commission had classified this sector as a Category 3 observation hold, which was official language for, we don't know what's in there. And the things that went to find out didn't come back. Cale knew this. He'd read the dossier 3 times on the transit flight. It had included 9 individual field reports, all of which end mid-sentence. He was starting to understand why. The trees here did not behave like trees. They were tall, 30 meters, 40, some of them, with trunks that tapered at the ground instead of widening, so that each one looked like it was balanced on a point, impossibly the way a top spins. Their canopy moved when there was no wind, not all at once, individually, slowly, like heads turning to watch you pass. Cale was a xenocartographer by training and a realist by temperament. He did not believe in haunted forests. He walked faster. The structure appeared the way all wrong things appear, without build-up, without warning, simply there when it hadn't been a moment before. A low rectangular shelter half buried in the root stone and dirt, its exterior covered in decades of gray-green growth, but its corners still sharp, still deliberate, still human in their right angles. The door was metal. It had a light above it, a real electric light, buzzing faintly on a battery that had no business still working, and it was on. Before Cale could decide whether this was a miracle or a trap, it opened. The woman was old, or else she had been made to look old. Tall, with close-cropped white hair and eyes that moved with a precision that unsettled him. Not erratically, not nervously, but with the careful, measured calm of someone who has survived by never looking away from the wrong thing at the wrong time. She had a blanket folded over one arm. She looked at Cale the way you look at something you expected and hoped wouldn't arrive. "Inside," she said, "before the light goes." Cale looked at the sky. The 3 pale suns were still high enough. He guessed 3 hours to dark. "I'm ISC survey designation. I know what you are," she said. "I've watched 12 like you cross the ridge in the last 4 years. Come inside or don't. I won't come for you after dark." Her name was Rhea. The others, there were 2 of them, a young man named Sev and a woman named Taris, were seated on low bunks when Cale came in, and both of them watched him with the specific expression of people who have learned not to hope but cannot entirely stop. Taris had the hollow eyes of someone who slept in shifts. Sev had a notebook in his lap, covered in writing that he hid against his chest when Cale looked at it. The shelter had one large wall that was from the inside a mirror, or appeared to be. Cale moved toward it, drawn by the same reflex that draws you toward any reflective surface. "Don't touch it," Rhea said. "Why?" "Because it's not a mirror." She set his blanket on the bunk they'd cleared for him. She explained the rules with the cadence of someone who had explained them until the words had worn grooves in the air. "You sleep in shifts, 2 awake at all times. When the suns go down, you stand at the wall and face outward. You do not cover your face. You do not close your eyes. You do not turn away. Nobody goes outside after dark. Nobody enters the tunnels to the east." The tunnels were marked with a red X on a hand-drawn map pinned above the water reclaimer. "And if someone does go into the tunnels?" Cale asked. Taris laughed. It was not a happy laugh. "The 4 people who were here before you went into the tunnels," Rhea said. "We don't discuss what happened after that." Cale sat down on the bunk and looked at Pip's cage. The bird had stopped singing. She was pressed against the far side of the enclosure, eyes fixed on the mirror wall, feathers flat. That night, Kale stood at the wall and saw them for the first time. They came out of the dark the way dark itself moves. Not through it, but as an expression of it. Tall, angular, bipedal, with limbs that bent in too many places and faces that were almost right, almost human. Their features moved the way a reflection moves when the mirror isn't quite flat. Everything in the correct position, but the proportions slightly wrong, the spacing slightly off, the expression approximately 5 degrees away from sincere. They pressed close to the glass and looked in, their eyes. If those were eyes, pale and fixed and voracious, the way you look at something you want to understand well enough to become. Kale's hand moved toward his sidearm. Don't, Rhea said from 2 meters to his left. I have a weapon. So did the 12 before you. He watched them. They watched back. He counted 9 of them on this visit. But there were shapes further back in the darkness that he couldn't resolve into a number. When they finally retreated, 90 minutes before the first sun came up, Kale sat down on the floor and held Pip's cage against his chest and listened to her start singing again, quietly, a tune he didn't recognize that she'd probably invented herself. And he thought, okay, let me think about this. In the weeks that followed, he thought about a great many things. He thought about the way the creatures moved, the gait that was almost human but not quite, the articulation of the hands that was close enough to be deeply wrong, the head tilts that mirrored the gestures of the shelter's occupants, with a delay of 2 or 3 seconds, like a recording played slightly late. He thought about what Rhea had said in the second week, when he'd asked her directly what they were. They're learning us, she said. That's what they do. They watch, and they absorb, and eventually they can become. Become what? Whatever they need to be. She said this with a flatness that took Kale a moment to parse. When he did, he looked at her differently, at her stillness, at the way she never quite mirrored anyone's gesture the way a relaxed person would, at the way she blinked on a schedule that was almost but not precisely human. Rhea, he said. I'm not one of them, she said, but that's exactly what I'd say if I were. He laughed, despite himself. She did not laugh, but something moved at the corner of her mouth. He began taking notes. It was what he did. It was the only thing he knew how to do when the ground dropped away from under him. He documented their behavior patterns, their approach vectors, the specific gestures they attempted to replicate, and the ones that seemed to confuse them. He noted that they could not imitate the way Taris rubbed her wrist when she was anxious, not convincingly. They would touch their own equivalent of a wrist, but the pressure was wrong, the rhythm wrong, the small, mindless quality of the gesture completely absent. He noted that they were drawn most powerfully to moments of human emotion they couldn't classify. Sev arguing with Taris about something small and domestic. The quality of the argument, the mix of frustration and warmth in it, seemed to press them harder against the glass than any other stimulus. He noted that Pip's singing made them go still. They don't know what to do with it, he told Rhea, watching 2 of them hovering at the glass, with their heads cocked at identical angles. They can't categorize it. It's not communication. It's not distress. It's not a territorial call. It's just music. Noise that exists for its own sake. And that bothers them, Rhea said. It confuses them, which might be the same thing. She looked at him for a long moment. You've been here 6 weeks, she said. The others stopped taking notes after 2. I'm not the others, Kale said. It wasn't bravado. It came out quieter than that. A statement of fact, almost apologetic, as if he was sorry to make the distinction. Sev found the hatch 6 weeks after Kyle arrived, behind the water reclaimer under a panel they'd all assumed was structural. A hatch that opened onto a ladder, and below that a corridor, and below that the research station of a xenobiologist named Dr. Veth Aran, who had entered the Vethra interior 17 years ago on a solo study permit and had not returned. The station was preserved, temperature controlled, somehow still running on a deep cell power source that Kale estimated had another decade of charge. The shelves held 40 years of handwritten journals, specimen containers, recording equipment, and the personal effects of a man who had clearly once loved his work very much. They spent 2 full nights down there reading. Aran's research told a story that was not quite what any of them expected. The creatures of the Vethra interior were not alien fauna. They were the original inhabitants. Sentient, ancient, capable of language and memory and culture, in forms that human science had never encountered because human science had never slowed down long enough to look. They had a name for themselves that Aran had spent 4 years learning to approximate, the Nay theory. In their own cosmology, they were the first people, the true formed, the ones who had been written into existence before the concept of death. They had once stood alongside an early human colonial wave on this world. 1,000 years ago, maybe more. Aran was not certain of the timeline. What he was certain of was that the relationship had ended in war. Not because of malice, but because of what human cartographers had done to this section of the planet. The early ISC designation teams had mapped the Vithara interior as uninhabited terrain and proceeded accordingly. Processing facilities had been built. Mining claims registered, and when the Neathiri resisted, they were not recognized as people resisting. They were categorized as fauna causing interference. It had taken a century of conflict before anyone with the authority to listen had listened. By then, the damage was done. The Neathiri had been confined to the interior forest by a border technology, the same technology that killed electronics at the exclusion line, that the ISC had installed with the specific intent of keeping them inside, indefinitely. A conservation zone, the records called it. The creatures watching through the glass wall were not predators. They were people who had been told, for 100 years, that their only value to the beings outside the border was what those beings could observe from a safe distance. Kale sat with this for a long time. He thought about the way they pressed against the glass. He thought about the way they mimicked human gestures. Not cruelly, not to mock, but with the focused intensity of people who have decided that understanding the other side of the glass is the only leverage they have. He thought about the mid-sentence ending of 9 field reports. He thought about Aran's final entry, which he'd read 3 times. I have come to understand that the tragedy here is not that they will not let us leave. The tragedy is that we built the wall and then forgot we'd built it. They are trapped by our architecture, and we are trapped by our ignorance, and neither side can see through the glass clearly enough to find the door. There was a door. Aran had been working on it when he died. The border technology was a network of field emitters, 47 of them, installed at intervals along the exclusion line. They ran on a centralized signal from a relay station 3 kilometers northeast of the shelter. If the relay station went down, the network would take 16 to 18 hours to fail. During that window, every electronic system inside the interior, including communication equipment, would function again. Aran had never managed to reach the relay station. He'd tried twice and retreated both times when the Neathiri cut him off. His notes described the encounters with a respect that bordered on grief. They are not trying to kill me. They are trying to prevent me from leaving. There is a difference. I do not think they understand that what I am trying to reach would free us both. Kale read this and sat very still and thought about the creatures at the glass and thought about himself and thought about the specific quality of the word, both. We need to talk to them, he said. The others stared at him. They can talk, he said. Aran spent years learning their language. His notes are right there. He also spent years in a room underground and then died, Terrace said. He died because he was trying to do it alone. Kale set the journal down. He was also trying to escape. I'm not trying to escape. I'm trying to have a conversation. About what? Sev asked. About the door. Rhea looked at him for a long time. He had learned by then to wait her out. She processed things more slowly than most people but more thoroughly, and her conclusions landed with a solidity that Sev's faster thinking rarely matched. You'd have to do it at the glass, she said finally. Yes, at night, when they're watching. Yes, they'll have seen your face for 2 months. They'll know your gestures. That's what I'm counting on. He spent 3 days studying Aran's language records. The Neathiri language was built around 3-dimensional gesture rather than sound. What looked like mimicry from the outside was actually their primary mode of communication, which meant that every evening they had spent watching the shelter's occupants was an evening of them shouting at people who didn't know they were being spoken to. Kale practiced. He practiced until Pip started mimicking his hand movements, her small feet dancing on her perch, cocking her head at him with what he could only describe as editorial skepticism. He practiced until Terrace stopped watching and went to sleep, and Sev started watching again and made notes of his own. On the 4th night he stood at the glass and waited. Same as always, surging out of the dark, pressing close, their faces doing their slow, imperfect approximations of human expression. Kale waited until the largest one, the one he had privately designated Subject 1, because it always positioned itself centrally, and the others deferred to it, had settled into its usual watching posture. Then Kale raised his hands, not to his sidearm, not defensively. He raised them the way Aran's notes described. Palms outward, thumbs touching, the particular angle of the wrists that in Neathiri translated roughly as, I am not performing for you. I am speaking to you, Subject 1 went absolutely still. Behind it, the others stilled too, a wave of silence that moved outward from the glass in both directions. Kale's hands moved through the first phrase Aran had documented. His gesture language was clumsy, he knew. The equivalent of a badly accented sentence spoken too slowly by someone who'd learned the words from a book. But the words were right. He'd checked them 6 times. What he said, approximately, was, "We found the old one's records. We know what was built. We know what it cost you. We are not the ones who built it, but we are standing in it. And that is the same thing. I want to find the door." Subject 1's head tilted at an angle that was not mimicry. That was the first real signal. The tilt was not something it had seen a human do, not something borrowed from observation. It was native. It answered him. The gestures were complex and fast, and Kale caught maybe a third of it. But the third he caught was enough to make his chest ache in a way he hadn't expected. What it said, what she said, Aran's gender markers were rough but useful, was something like, "We have been watching this room for 40 years. We have learned every gesture your kind uses when they are afraid. We have never, in 40 years, seen one of you try to speak." Kale stood there for a moment. Then he said, slowly, hands careful, wrists at the correct angle, "I am sorry it took this long." The night stretched. The 3 pale suns were a long way off. But the glass between them was no longer quite a barrier. It was a surface, a place where 2 sides of something could almost touch. The relay station was 3 kilometers northeast. Kale knew the Naethri would know where it was. He also knew they would try to stop him from reaching it. Not because they wanted him trapped, but because the last human who'd tried to reach it had been part of the ISC, and the ISC's relationship with the Naethri was not a relationship at all. It was an exhibition. He needed to communicate the difference. He had 4 more nights at the glass. He used all of them. His vocabulary improved. His gesture language grew less like a broken recording and more like a rough but functional conversation. Subject 1 Kale eventually rendered as something like Naya Varas, which Aran's note suggested meant first light before the sun. Ta, which was an extraordinary name, was patient with him in the way that someone is patient who has been waiting for a very long time and has learned that impatience is a luxury for people who have options. Kale told her about the relay station, about the 16 to 18-hour window, about what would happen after, that he could call for a recovery team, yes, but more importantly that he could transmit Aran's complete research to the ISC's legal division, because Aran had documented everything, the original war, the confinement order, the specific ISC charter violations that the border technology represented, and the ISC legal division was staffed by people who were afraid of liability in a way that transcended the fear of most things. Naivaras's response took a long time. Kale caught fragments of it. The part about "your records say the same things your kind always says before they leave and do nothing." The part about "we have heard the word liberation from 14 people in this room, and liberation has never arrived." The part about "we have been patient for 100 years, and patience has not opened the cage." He didn't argue with any of it. That was the thing, you couldn't argue with any of it. It was all true. What he said was, "I know, and I am not asking you to believe me. I am asking you to let me try. Because I will fail or I will not, and either way you will have lost nothing you do not already lose every night." Naya Varas was still for a long time. Then she moved her hands. They guided him northeast. All 9 of them, the full complement that visited the glass, and others he hadn't seen before, moving through the dark forest in a loose cordon that was not an escort, and not a threat, and not quite either. Kale walked with his sidearm holstered, and both hands visible, and Pip's cage in the crook of his arm because he'd refused to leave her. A stubbornness he couldn't fully explain, except that it had seemed important to bring the bird into the dark forest where she'd spent every night, pressed against the far wall of her cage. She sang the whole way. The small invented tune, the one that had no origin and no destination, just sound for the sake of sound in the middle of a forest that had not heard anything like it for a very long time. He heard the Naethri around him go quiet. Then slowly one of them began to try to echo it. Not well. The sound they made was wrong in pitch and texture, emerging from a physiology that was built for something else entirely. But the intent was there, and the intent was what mattered. Kale walked through the dark forest between beings who were learning to sing. Badly, tentatively, because a small brass-feathered bird had given them the template, and something about that broke him open in a way he hadn't braced for, and he walked the rest of the way to the relay station with his jaw set, and his eyes burning and his hands completely steady. The relay station was a squat gray box on a concrete plinth. covered in the same gray-green growth as everything else in the forest, but immediately recognizable to anyone who'd spent time in ISC fieldwork, which Cale had. The access panel was an older model. He had the override code in his suit's offline memory, standard equipment for a survey scout. The kind of thing nobody thought you'd ever use because nobody anticipated you'd end up inside the exclusion line. He opened the panel. The fail system was a cascade. You couldn't simply cut power. You had to introduce a specific conflicting signal on the emitter frequency. Otherwise, the system would interpret the interruption as tampering and reinforce. Aran had documented this. Aran had been unable to act on it because he'd been alone, and the process required simultaneous access to the primary and secondary input ports on opposite sides of the station housing. Cale stood at the station and looked at its sides and then turned to the dark behind him. "I need help," he said, out loud in standard, because his gesture vocabulary didn't have the word for technical assistance yet. Then he raised his hands and did the closest approximation he could. Varas emerged from the dark. She looked at him. She looked at the station. She walked around it once in that careful, too-many-angles way of hers. And Cale watched her look at both ports with the focused attention of someone who has spent 100 years learning to study things from a distance, and is only now being allowed to get close. He pointed to the secondary port. He memed the gesture of inserting and holding. She looked at him for a very long moment. Then she reached out and placed her hand, four-fingered, the joints bending backward, the temperature of her palm. When it briefly brushed his wrist something between cold and cool, like water from a deep well, on the secondary port. Cale hit the primary with his override code. The relay station made a sound like a question, a rising electronic tone that hung in the air for 2 seconds, and then went quiet. 3 kilometers to the southwest, the border field began its 16 to 18-hour death. Cale's communicator flickered on 4 minutes later. He sat down against the plinth and sent 3 transmissions. A distress signal on the ISC emergency frequency, a priority data package to the Survey Commission's legal division containing Aran's complete research archive, and a personal message to his sister on Carentha Station that said only, "I'm okay. I found something important. It's going to take a while to explain." He sat in the dark while the Neatheri moved around him, and above him, some of them in the trees now, he could see their AC pale and luminous, like will-o-wisps through the branches. And he thought about the long specific stupidity of building a wall and forgetting you'd built it, and about all the people who had stood in the shelter and looked through the glass, and never once thought to raise their hands. Varas settled beside him on the plinth. She was taller sitting than most humans were standing. Cale felt her attention on him in the same way he'd felt it through the glass, that precise weighing focus, but different now, closer, less like being studied and more like being seen. She said something. He caught most of it this time. His gesture language was rough, but it was working, she said. "You brought the singing creature into the dark." He looked at Pip's cage. The bird was asleep, tucked against the corner of the enclosure, feathers loose, as calm in this forest at this hour as she'd ever been anywhere, he said. "She isn't afraid of the dark. She's afraid of silence." Varas was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the careful deliberateness of someone speaking in a second language, someone who's speaking in a third, "We have been silent for 100 years. Not because we had nothing to say. Because there was no one at the glass who knew they were being spoken to." Cale said, "I know," she said. "Will your people come?" He said, "Yes. Some of them will want to help. Some of them will want to categorize. Some will not know the difference. That is the problem with my people." She said something that his vocabulary didn't fully cover. Something about patience being different when you choose it. Chosen patience. Patience as a form of power, rather than a form of endurance. I held the concept and tried to match it to a gesture, and managed something approximate. She watched his hands. She said, "That is better than the last time you tried that one." It was, he realized, a joke. Or the nearest thing to a joke that could survive the crossing from one language to another. He laughed, actually, laughed in the dark on a concrete plinth, with 9 or more ancient beings in the trees around him. And Pip woke up briefly and made her affronted sound, and went back to sleep, and somewhere above him in the canopy something shifted, and Cale thought it might have been laughter too. If laughter could be made by a being with a different body, using different sounds for different reasons that all added up to the same release. The IC recovery shuttle arrived 14 hours later. It came in low over the exclusion line with its running lights on, and a legal attaché from the Survey Commission's Human Rights Division sitting in the co-pilot seat, with a tablet full of documents, and an expression that suggested she had not slept in some time, and was not planning to until she understood what she was looking at. Kale met her at the tree line. He was not alone. The Netheri stood in the forest behind him. Not the 9 he'd come to know, but dozens, maybe more. Standing in the canopy and at the roots and along the ridge of the exclusion line that no longer enforced anything. Just a line in the ground now. Just geography. Neavara stood 2 paces behind Kale's left shoulder. She was tall enough that the legal attaché, a woman named Riva Solis who had spent 15 years in ISC compliance and had developed a professional immunity to being surprised, took a visible moment to compose herself. "Miss Solis," Kale said, "I have a lot to tell you. I'm going to need you to listen to most of it before you start talking." Solis looked at him, looked at Nyavaras, looked at the tablet in her hand and the documents on it and the legal framework of the IIC and the specific language of the Vithara exclusion order that she had already, on the flight in, identified 6 separate violations of. "I've read Dr. Iran's research," she said. "Good. It's been in our archives for 11 years. Kale looked at her. "And nobody read it." She had the grace not to answer that one quickly. He said, "There's a woman inside. She's been in there for 4 years. There's a young man who's been in there for 2. I want them extracted today. Understood? And I want a formal negotiation team on this planet within 90 days. Not a survey team. Not an observation post. A negotiation team with the authority to bind the ISC to an agreement. Do you understand what I'm asking for?" "I understand what you're asking for," she said. "I don't know yet if I can deliver it." "No," Kale said. "But I need you to go back and make it your problem. Because the people in that forest have been waiting for someone to make it their problem for 100 years. And the only thing that's changed is that now there's a paper trail you can't ignore, and a man who isn't going to leave until something moves." Solis looked at Nyavaras again. Nyavaras looked back with that precise measuring gaze that had watched through glass for decades and had learned to see everything in it. "What's she saying?" Solis asked quietly. Kale's hands moved. A question. Nyavaras answered. He translated. "She says she's heard this conversation before. The one where someone from outside the line says they'll fix it. She says she believes you mean it. She's not yet certain you can." Solstice was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Tell her I've read enough of Iran's work to know she's right to doubt us. Tell her I want to earn the benefit of the doubt. Tell her I'd like to start today if she's willing." Kale's hands moved. Nyavaras was still for a long time. Then she raised her own hands. Both of them, palms outward, thumbs touching, the specific angle of the wrists that Kale had learned from a dead man's notes and had carried through a dark forest and had pressed against a glass wall in the middle of the night until someone who'd been waiting long enough to stop counting had finally looked at him differently. "I am not performing for you," the gesture said. "I am speaking to you." Solis didn't know the language. She looked at Kale. "It means yes," he said. "It means let's talk." He set Pip's cage down in the grass at the tree line and opened the door. Because she'd been inside long enough, and she was small and alive, and the forest was enormous and full of things that didn't have words for music yet, but were learning, and she flew into it with the complete confidence of a creature that does not know it isn't supposed to survive here, her feathers catching the light of 3 pale suns all at once, and she sang the whole way up.